welcome everyone. It looks like we've got a group where hopefully people will be able to get some personal attention and questions asked. So I'm going to be doing this, which is something I've done for quite a few years now, was sort of an hour and a half presentation on what I call principles of biological systems. What are the environmental conditions necessary to, you know, support plants in manifesting their full potential. We've been talking organizationally about nutrient density. We think it correlates to flavor and aroma and shelf life and pest and disease resistance and soil health and carbon sequestration and ecosystem services and farm viability. All those things we think are interconnected. And so this presentation is, to the best of my ability, what are some of the environmental conditions we want to be managing for on our farms to accomplish that. All right, the nutrient meter, I see that question. We'll deal with that later, but yes. Okay, so I usually do this with a whiteboard in front of people, and we have a more of an interactive, engaged process. So let's just imagine that your Q&A box are your questions. And if there are things you'd like to have me see if I can weave into the presentation, feel free to put them in there as Aaron was explaining. And I'm going to do without a whiteboard now. So we're all going to have to sort of envision in our minds some of the things I'm discussing. I'm not sophisticated enough to have good slides for the things I like to talk about. So yeah, all that being said, my name is Dan Kittredge. I am from Massachusetts, grew up on an organic farm, have for the last 10 years been running the Bionutrient Food Association, whose mission is increasing quality in the food supply. We are a grassroots organization with local chapters around North America. We do an annual conference called the Soil Nutrition Conference. We, for the past 4 years, have been working on the Real Food Campaign, which is taking this question of nutrient density to the next level, starting to begin to define it and to build the meters. And then working with partner organizations. VABF is one of our partners this year, I believe, in getting some samples sent in. That's very exciting. A number of partners around North America and Europe engaging in that process. So that's all sort of background and framing. When it comes to the process of plants being healthy, I like to start with the concept that plants are green. Just about all of them are green. And the reason that plants are green is because they have covered their body in these things called chloroplasts, in which occurs this process called photosynthesis. Basically the plants, are trying to maximize the amount of sugar they can produce through photosynthesis. That's why they cover their bodies in this green color. And the reason they're doing that is because in nature, there's no fertilizer, right? Nobody's adding triple superphosphate or, tons of compost or liquid fish or whatever. In nature, the plants have evolved the capacity to feed themselves, and it's through a beautiful symbiotic ecosystem function. And what the plants do that's special is they make sugar that they then take a majority of and inject out of their bodies into the soil, and also actually out their leaves to feed the gut flora, the microbes that are covering them. So people may have heard the term rhizosphere, the area surrounding the plant root where the vast majority of the microbes in the soil reside. Hopefully people are conversant with the concept that it's, the microbes in the soil which are doing the job of digesting the soil and feeding it to the plant, digesting the air, taking the nitrogen from the atmosphere, the N2 gas, and converting it into a format that can be fed to the plant. And so the plants make these sugars and then feed them out to the microbes, who then eat them, go about their lives, digest the soil, digest the atmosphere, feed it into the plant. And it's this beautiful sort of virtuous circle. And so that's the first thing I want to really emphasize, is that in nature, there's no fertilizer. In nature, the plants have evolved the capacity to feed themselves, and their critical symbiote in that process is their gut flora, the microbes, both in the soil and on their leaf surface. And so I like to focus this conversation, this presentation, on what do we need to do to ensure that the microbes are happy? Because if we do not have that situation going on in the soil, we should not expect the plant to be flourishing, should not expect it to be getting all of its needs met. You certainly can add, you can do tissue tests, you can do foliar sprays. There's all kinds of ways of making up for the fact that the plant's, gut flora is not healthy. But when you get to the point where the gut flora is healthy, the amount of effort and management and cost, et cetera, that you need to engage drops off dramatically. So hopefully that's all broadly, clear. There's 5 things I like to say that you need to have in the environment for the soil life to flourish. They must have air to breathe. So if your soil is very tight and compacted, and there's limited air flow potential, you should expect the microbes to be asphyxiating and unable to breathe. And when they can't breathe and they're dead, then the plant can't be fed. So tight, tense soil is certainly an issue to be addressing. After air, we've got water. Microbes are also, as living organisms, they need water to drink. They need access to moisture to function. I like to say, if you were to not water your dairy cows for a week, or your chickens for a week, you might find that they're not doing too well. Or your chicken, or your children, or your cat. We need water. We understand that from animals' perspective. In many cases, when people are irrigating their fields, if they are engaging in that kind of a process in a drought year, you'll see that the drip tape may be right at the base of the tomato plant, right down the middle of the bed, but the soil 6 inches out or 12 inches out or even further is actually quite dry, powdery. I would call that dirt, not soil. What happens when you are not maintaining moisture in the soil is that the microbes shut down. And so while you're thinking potentially about watering the plant, you're not thinking about watering the microbes. And so in my mind, maintaining moisture across the entire soil profile is a foundational component if you are going to be working with life. So we'll talk about strategies for maintaining air and maintaining water as we proceed here today. I just want to sort of lay out the most rudimentary components. So air, water, the microbes need food to eat. So in the summertime, when the plants have green leaves and they're injecting that sugar down into the soil, we can see that is the vector by which the microbes can be fed. In the spring, the plants may be fairly small and far apart. And so you can understand that if the soil is bare, there's not a lot of food going into that microbial ecosystem. So keeping the microbes fed 12 months of the year. Think about April, think about March, maybe if you didn't get cover crops in, and the winter's over, the ground's thawing out, presuming it thaws out down there, or even freezes in Virginia. I'm guessing it freezes down there, at least occasionally. Springtime's coming, ground's thawed out. There's not a lot of cover there in the soil, not a lot of plant material from last year. Those microbes are still there. And if you don't have sort of organic matter stockpiled in one form or another, brown carbon or green carbon, you should expect those microbes to not have any food to eat, and then they will shut down because of that. So really envisioning, hundreds of quadrillions of individuals, living in the top 6 inches of every acre, all needing to be having access to food and water and air every day of the year. When you start thinking about your management practices of your soil, if you think about times of the year when any one of those things may not be present, that's going to be a limiting factor. That's going to be sort of shutting down the system, and maybe you'll be adding water back in at some point, but they really shut down at that point. So you want to try to minimize those limiting factors, if that makes sense. You want to create a dynamic where we always have access to air, always have access to water, always have access to food for the microbes in that ecosystem. The final 2 points I like to focus on are, one of them is minerals. In many cases, due to historical factors. If you're in Virginia, you guys, I don't think got glaciated recently. Um, it's been raining, whatever it is, 30, 40, 50 inches a year for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. A lot of the critical elements that are necessary for life to function at the core of enzyme systems and in biochemistry, things like, boron and sulfur and molybdenum and copper and zinc, et cetera, may not be present at sufficient levels in the root zone of your plants for life to function. Um, there's one example I like to use of cobalt at the center of the compound we call B12. And we know that humans need B12 to exist. Um, you know, the amount that would, sit on the head of a pin. We don't need a lot to exist, but if we don't have that B12 in our bodies, we're dead. We are, and at the center of that compound B12 is one atom of cobalt. So you can safely say that we are B12 dependent organisms. Similarly, about 80% of the microbes in the soil also require B12 to exist. And so if you don't have sufficient cobalt in your soil, it's physiologically impossible for microbes to operate, or at least a vast majority of them. So I asked the question, when's the last time you addressed or even assessed your cobalt level in the soil? There's a lot of things that leach readily, the anions, things like boron and sulfur. So if you haven't addressed those in the past couple of years, I can pretty much guarantee you've got deficiencies in those fields and in those components. So we do, life does need some basic building blocks in the form of these different elements, and they can be sourced through things like rock dust and sea salt and very inexpensive, naturally occurring raw materials that don't need to be fertilizers or anything like that. I'm not suggesting we need to add fertilizers, but and in a well-functioning ecosystem where you've got, perennial polycultures that have, maybe big tall trees with big deep roots and things like that, those minerals, which may not be in the top 6 inches, but maybe at 2 feet or 4 feet or 8 feet down in the soil profile, can be cycled up and around through that sort of perennial polyculture system. In many cases, in our agricultural settings, we don't have that. We've been doing annual crops that have a fairly short root zone. And so the ability to access things that are deeply into the subsoil is effectively not functional. So air, water, minerals, food, and the final component I like to talk about is life itself. The microbes themselves must be present. And if anybody has, is conversant with the concept of an antibiotic, right? Antibiotic, against life. People take antibiotics when they get sick, for various reasons. And we understand that our gut flora is, it's microbes, and it gets, it's like genocide for them when you take an antibiotic, and then your digestion is weak after that. It takes a while to rebuild that. In many cases, they say you never come back. It's like you want to start off with that colostrum and never have an antibiotic. But in many cases, our soils have been exposed to things like fungicides and insecticides, herbicides, acid rain, nuclear fallout from the testing that happened in the 40s and 50s and 60s. There's a number of environmental conditions that have transpired in the past, decades or centuries that have effectively caused the full suite of microbes that initially were in your soil to no longer be there. Maybe some 5% are present. And so working to systemically reestablish that full spectrum of microbial community is also foundational. It's good to have the air and the water and the minerals and the food, but if you don't have the microbes themselves, then it doesn't matter. So those are the 5 things I like to talk about as priorities, and get into techniques to manage for them. And try not to get too fancy and wonky in the science and remember all kinds of complicated recipes and things like that. It's really, if you reach down into the soil, and you can reach down into the soil and pick up a handful of it, that probably means that there's some aeration. How far can you reach down? That's a real simple test. If you can go down an inch and a half and it starts to get underneath your fingernails and get really uncomfortable, then that should tell you you have soil compaction issues. You have no air. That's a foundational issue that needs to be addressed. Similarly, if you reach down to pick up a handful of soil and it's powdery dry, that tells you there's not enough water. So a lot of these things, I would say you don't need fancy machines and assessment techniques and books to discern. It actually is in many cases quite common sense. And if you can at least get these bases in place, then the nuance of management we can deal with later. But getting these foundations in place, I think, is key. I'm seeing a couple questions here from Roger. Difference between brown and green carbon for microbes. So brown carbon would be dead plant material, straw, hay, leaves, dead roots, things like that, which in the wintertime is probably the only form that your plants may have access to. If you're growing in, your microbes may have access to, so that's a great thing. Cover crops are the green carbon in the wintertime. Always, great to have them if you can. As much as possible to having living roots in the soil as many months of the year as possible is generally the objective. Presumably that you have some top growth as well. It's not just the roots. But I like to say, where in nature do you see bare soil? And I would argue that where nature is doing well, you don't see bare soil. And if sort of one of our foundational objectives is, and I may presume this, but I think most people would agree, that our objective is to be working in harmony with nature or in symbiosis with nature. If nature doesn't do bare soil, then we need to look at our management practices and see if we can, use that as a guide. Wherever we've got bare soil, we're effectively violating the pattern of nature. And I'll just use an example here to sort of maybe go to one of the points about how to facilitate that aeration of soil. Here in Massachusetts, growing up on a farm, every fall we'd plant our garlic sometime in middle of October or thereabouts. Generally, the ground wouldn't freeze until November. And after planting the garlic, we would mulch it with usually hay, mulch hay, and oftentimes, we would be pulling out carrots adjacent, or whatever the fall crops were. Maybe winter squash grew there, but in many cases we actually have bare soil going into the fall directly adjacent to that garlic patch. And my experience every spring is that when you're out there in March and into April, and the up here, probably the ground doesn't, reliably thaw out until April 1st. But I'm guessing down there it's earlier. As the garlic is starting to grow, coming up through the mulch, if you were to sort of pull the mulch back, because sometimes the garlic gets stuck, and you pull it back and you go down to the ground, you'll see like piles of earthworm castings. And if you reach down, you can pick up a handful of soil and you can just smell that beautiful aromatic soil smell. Directly adjacent, sort of 3 feet away, in the area where the garlic wasn't planted and it went into the winter bare, you'll see oftentimes in April that soil will be tight, hard, cracked dirt. You can't get your hand into it. It doesn't have a smell if you were to get it up out the ground. And so, within a 3-foot distance, you've got beautiful aromatic earthworms, soil, and over here you got tight, hard dirt. They both went through the winter. They both experienced the same temperature. They both experienced the same rain, the same snow. What's the difference? The difference is that one was covered with mulch and one was not. And so in my mind, as I said before, the microbes are there living in the soil all year long. And if you're able to keep them fed with that brown carbon, with that mulch, they will effectively keep that soil alive. And where they're not fed, they'll turn to dirt. And so, there's been a lot of talk in the past couple of years about no-till and minimal till and, minimizing soil disturbance. I think there's a lot of good reasons why those are valuable things to do. However, if your soil is tight and hard, it doesn't, if it doesn't breathe, it doesn't matter if you tilled or not. You can be proud of yourself for not tilling, but if there's no air in the soil, then it doesn't really matter because your plants aren't going to grow very well. So just as far as an order of priority is concerned, maintaining aeration is central. One way to facilitate that is to keep the soil alive. One way to facilitate that is to keep it covered. And so, yeah, I just want to make that point. Farmers oftentimes do till the soil in the spring because it's tight and hard, and the plants won't grow unless it's loose. And so, if you want to be able to step out of that tillage cycle, one of the things you're going to need to do is you're going to need to keep the soil alive, because that was what will keep it aerated. So there's one, I hope, point there. Good ways to break up clay without tillage. We have a lot of it in Virginia. Yes. So, okay, good ways to break up clay. I think I would suggest taking a soil test and assessing the calcium and magnesium ratios. As I understand it, people may be familiar with a researcher called Dr. William Albrecht. He ran the soil department at the University of Missouri for, gosh, I think it was 20 or 30 years, and developed a sort of a cation exchange, mineral balancing sort of set of protocols, and identified that calcium is a large, well, he didn't identify it, but calcium is actually a much larger atom than magnesium, but it's one of the atoms that's most present on the soil colloid. So if you've ever seen the pictures of the clay with the minerals attached to it, or the sand with the minerals attached to it, it's called the colloid. In many cases, over time, as the ground is weathered and worn, these things like calcium and magnesium are removed from the ecosystem, and they're replaced with hydrogen. So when you've got a low pH soil, that basically what that means is lots of hydrogen. You can add things like gypsum, maybe 500 pounds of gypsum per acre per year, until you get that calcium level back up to where you want 68% on the base saturation. Gypsum calcium sulfate is it's relatively soluble, so it will facilitate that calcium availability, but that calcium will actually, as it proceeds through the soil profile, it'll attach to the soil colloid, it'll kick the hydrogen out. And because it's bigger, it literally will cause the clay platelets to separate. So actually, a good bioavailable form of calcium in a calcium deficient soil, which I think a lot of those are down there in Virginia, would be a really good physics way to open up the soil, to loosen the soil. Certainly there's all kinds of mechanical things you can do. But if the foundational issue is that you've got that sort of weathered function, you want to be remineralizing it, and something like a gypsum would probably be a very appropriate thing to be using. In many cases, people will, if they have a low pH, they'll add limestone, and they don't differentiate between dolomitic lime and calcitic lime. In many cases, it's the dolomitic lime that has the magnesium in it, will have the effect of keeping that soil very tight. So if you're going to be using limestone, make sure it's a calcitic limestone. That'll help to flocculate, to open up that soil structure. Certainly, other than that, deep-rooted cover crops are very valuable. If you do want to go through with a ripper, a yeoman's plow, to sort of crack open the subsoil and have various humates and microbes and minerals sort of dripped into that slot with cover crop seeds, there are ways to mechanically begin to break open that tight subsoil structure. But I would say that foundationally, probably increasing the calcium level in the soil will be systemically addressing that issue. If you haven't engaged that, hopefully that's a helpful point. So we've covered soil cover and keeping it aerated to some extent. I see a question here from Roger about cobalt. Tiny amounts of it are needed in a garden. So yeah, Cobalt sulfate is a product that you can buy. You may be able to buy, you see that you've got copper sulfate, you can buy zinc sulfate, manganese sulfate. So as a certified organic grower, if you have a soil test that identifies mineral deficiencies in these trace elements, you are allowed to use these products even though they're not naturally occurring. So cobalt sulfate is one source. And yeah, I would say probably 4 pounds per acre of cobalt sulfate to address a deficiency would be a good application rate. If you're interested in more naturally occurring sources of these things, as I said earlier, the way that nature remineralizes herself over time is through a couple basic functions. Volcanism is one. So when the volcanoes blow their top and spread a bunch of minerals around the immediate bioregion, after Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980 in the Pacific Northwest, farmers for a few years afterwards were like, wow, things are growing really well. All that volcanic ash was actually caused the plants to be healthier. That doesn't happen in all areas too often. Another mode is through glaciation. So as the soils wear out and the climate gets out of balance, the ice caps build and the glaciers come through and they grind up the parent material, the parent rock, and spread it out across the landscape. In many cases, actually, it starts to blow. There's these big windstorms and it sort of blows around the planet. Interestingly, the Amazon is fed by winds coming off with minerals by winds coming off of Africa. People may be aware of that, but there's when these big windstorms in Africa, they literally, clouds of minerals go when they drop on the Amazon. And that's because the Amazon has not been glaciated for millions of years. When they cut the trees down, they get a couple years of crops from the minerals that were in the trees, but it's a weathered, weak soil, and then they have to move on because the crops no longer grow because the foundational minerals in the soil are weak. So glaciation is one way that remineralization occurs naturally. Here in New England, we were glaciated 10,000 years ago. I don't think you guys were down there in Virginia. But that doesn't mean that we can't access the finely crushed rock dust, which is the product that facilitates that remineralization. And so I like to say anywhere you've got you got blacktop, there's a local quarry somewhere that is where the rock in that pavement and that came from. And so where you've got roads that are made out of cement, you generally have a subsoil which is a limestone subsoil, and that would not work for this purpose. But if you are if you've got quarries, local quarries, where they're digging out rock, hard rock, basalts are the best, granites are good. They usually have a waste product, which they call float or fines. And that can be accessed for oftentimes less than $10 a ton, less than $5 a ton. Sometimes it's free, $2 a ton. But that, say it's basalt, as a rock has about 45 different elements in it. And so the waste product of the mining industry, the quarrying industry, is this finely crushed rock dust, which is exactly what the glaciers are leaving. It's got 45 different elements in it, and they're not soluble. So you can spread that rock dust on your land, not really worry too much about what's in it and what's not in it, because the microbes will have access to that raw material, and they can go and solubilize and digest it as and when the plant says it needs them. So that would be one source of the cobalt that I would suggest potentially is those sort of locally occurring broad spectrum rock dusts. Also, sea salt is a great mineral amendment. I generally recommend about 75 pounds per acre per year, at least east of the Mississippi. Anywhere that it rains, 30 inches a year or more, you're never going to have that application of salt build up in any kind of a negative fashion, but you do have 90 plus different elements naturally occurring in sea salt. So it's a wonderful broad spectrum mineral amendment that will facilitate a lot of those biochemical reactions that life needs to function, that your plants may not be getting access to in a soil that has been weathered for many thousands of years. There's other ways of going about it. Certainly you take your soil tests, you can as we said earlier, the cobalt sulfate and the zinc sulfate, you can target these elements specifically, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. But just want to sort of give the broad spectrum of sources of these minerals, at least for a concept's purpose. Sea salt better, worse than kelp? Kelp is entirely different than sea salt. Kelp is, it's like kudzu from the ocean. It's a very vigorous growing plant, lots of growth hormones. It's got a lot of really wonderful compounds in it that facilitate plant growth, but it is not a systemic source. I mean, you have to use a lot of kelp to get the mineral quotient that you get out of sea salt. So I think they're both good. I wouldn't necessarily be, I personally don't use much kelp on my land. I do understand that it's a relatively well harvested resource. It's maybe too much harvested. I don't think we need to be bringing it in from off land. I think if you've got things like Japanese knotweed and kudzu and bittersweet that are basically all plants that grow with that really vigorous, rapid form, that in many cases are considered to be invasives, they have the exact energy in it that kelp does that causes our plants to grow well. So I think we can source off of our land some of those materials and not need to have them come from a industrial source. Certainly fine if you want to use it as a liquid. Sometimes it's a good, stimulant, plant health stimulant, but shouldn't be necessary. All right. Will constant irrigation eventually build up salt in the soil? From Seven Springs Farm. Well, it depends on what your source of water is. If you have a water source which is a well that may have high levels of minerals in it, coming from 400 feet down or 500 feet down, and especially if you're irrigating in a hoop house where it doesn't rain, you can find, sort of mineral buildup, salt buildup of various sorts in that hoop house from irrigation water. Generally, I would say that it would take a significant amount of irrigation water that had pretty heavy mineral levels in it to cause that salt buildup outside in an area on the East Coast where it rains significantly. Certainly in the out west where it doesn't rain very much, it's very easy to get that salt buildup in the soil from irrigation water. The only area that we commonly experience that on the East Coast is in hoop houses, I would say, and specifically from well water that has high mineral levels in it. So if you're pulling out of a stream or a pond, you're unlikely to get that effect, even in a hoop house. Okay, so I talked about minerals to some degree. I've talked about the aeration, the hydration piece. Let's just pivot to that with the question about irrigation systems. So I think, I'll just say that in nature, you don't see irrigation systems being set up. Plants seem to have been able to maintain hydration even during periods of relatively significant drought. Certainly the plants may become a little bit dry, but it takes a lot of weeks of no rain at all before plants in nature start to, really apparently suffer. Much faster, the crops in our fields seem to suffer from lack of rain. So what is it going on in the field which is allowing those plants to have water that's not, or sort of in the meadow or in the forest is allowing those plants to have access to water that's not happening in the field? And I think this is an important question, because if we are, again, going back to the model of working with nature, understanding how nature waters herself, how do those plants get access to water even in a drought, would hopefully give us a model for how we can manage our crops differently. So there's a couple key points I want to make. One of them is that people may have heard of the tidal force, the the fact that, you know, at the edge of the ocean, the water appears to actually does go up and down, you know, twice a day, high tide and low tide. People have heard about that. It has to do with the location of the moon and gravity and things like that. It's always seemed kind of magical to me, but regardless, the principle of the tidal force does not only apply in the ocean, right? The gravity from the moon lifting the water and lowering the water applies on land as well. And I think this is a point that people need to sort of wrap their heads around. It might take a minute or two to do it. I've seen this most obviously in a drought sort of time of year, you know, in a sort of a seasonal stream, a seasonal, you know, a riffle, a brook, that in a serious drought will stop flowing. If you're out there at certain times of the day, but if you go out there at other times of the day, you'll see a little trickle. And so you'll see it, it'll trickle and then it'll stop, and then it'll trickle and then it'll stop, and it'll trickle and then it'll stop. If anybody's, you know, been out there and watched these things, my irrigation system is a sort of a, you know, from the, you know, we basically just dug a couple big holes in a stream, and they fill up with water, and I use that for irrigation, surface water. Very simple, very inexpensive sump pump into a, you know, a 350 gallon tote and gravity feed drip tape, really inexpensive irrigation system. And so I'm watching the stream during the drought to see if it's flowing, and lo and behold, it flows a couple times a day and it dries up a couple times a day, and it hasn't rained in 4 weeks. What's going on is that the water table is literally rising and lowering, you know, based on the tidal force. And so I think this is sort of maybe a bit of a sort of a, you know, a shift in thinking, but imagine that that's actually happening, that it does happen. The tidal force does actually affect water under the ground every day. And in areas where we have reasonably well-established root zones, you know, ideally again, or likely again in those perennial areas, the roots are far enough down that when the water rises in the water table, they can access it and use it to keep growing. When you're in an annual cropping system and your roots are maybe 6 inches deep, and you maybe have a subsoil compaction at you know, 8 inches or 12 inches, that subsoil compaction actually is so strong that the, you know, the tidal force can't lift the water through it. And so, you know, I think there's some really important points here about why perennials do better, or if you're going to have annuals, ideally have them in some reasonable proximity to perennials, or ensure that you don't have subsoil compaction. And, you know, permaculturalists talk about stockpiling water on the land and having pools and ponds and all that kind of stuff. I think, you know, one of the benefits of Appalachia is the land's not flat. I'm really happy to live, even though I'm in from Massachusetts, we are in the Appalachian mountain chain, and it's hilly, it's rocky, it goes up, it goes down, it's not flat land. And so being able to stockpile water, build ponds, you know, higher on the land, if you've got a couple acres to play with, in many cases you can do that. You can stockpile water through building ponds, etc., higher in the landscape, and that will slowly gravity feed down into the fields as well. So I really think systemically keeping the water table high by stockpiling water across the landscape in the form of ponds will facilitate this tidal force actually getting water to your plant's roots from below in a drought scenario. But just to frame that out, certainly overhead irrigation, certainly drip tape, there's all kinds of ways of irrigating. But ideally you'd like to be in a place where your management of the landscape is facilitating that irrigation being occurring sort of passively. So either way, you must have water for your plants and your microbes. Otherwise, you should not be surprised when things don't work. But sort of taking a step back and thinking about it systemically, and you know, seeing how to manage the landscape so that there's as little active daily work necessary as possible, I think is just a point I want to make. All right, azomite as an amendment, and when is it applicable? And would it work better in combination with other amendments? If so, which ones, and do you use it? Azomite is A to Z of minerals and trace elements. It's an acronym. People may not know where the word azomite came from. A to Z of minerals and trace elements. A very nice product. It certainly has a broad spectrum of elements in it. I think it's north of 50 different elements in it. A really nice broad spectrum mineral. My biggest concern, or the reason I don't use azomite, is because of its relative cost. As a farmer, if you look at the price per pound on azomite, it's oftentimes as much as $2 a pound, which is outrageous when you can get a ton of rock dust for $2. If you're in a garden environment, just a couple hundred square feet or a couple thousand square feet, and price isn't an issue, I think it's a great material to use. I would generally be using other rock minerals of a similar nature that are much less expensive. People may have heard of the concept that marketing costs money. So if you've heard of azomite, it's because it's been marketed. And so the fact that it costs money to market it means that they have to charge more for it so they can cover their costs, if that makes sense. So there's no shortage of rock dust in the world, right? All of the continents are made up of rock. There's plenty of rock material out there. The question is really whether we should be paying $4,000 a ton for it, or $4 a ton. So I don't use azomite. I do use a similar material called desert dynamine. Very, very similar material, much less expensive in things like a fertilizer mix at maybe 100 pounds to the acre. But that recipe and if in combination with other amendments and which ones, so I would can call it azomite or call it desert dynamine. The recipe that I would use in the spring as a broad spectrum sort of a mineral amendment includes that, as well as humates, gypsum, rock phosphate, green sand. I actually use a lime-like material called carbonatite, but you could put a limestone in there if you can't get carbonatite. Sulpomag, as well as, and those are all at about 100 pounds per acre, is the recipe. And then also I would do, I've got a nice sort of humified compost at about 150 pounds per acre. And then 50 pounds per acre of kelp meal, sea salt, and alfalfa meal. And that's a sort of a one size fits all annual spring fertilizer that I oftentimes use when planting. So that would be how I personally use azomite or a similar type material. Let me see, there's another one down there. Permies advocate working with water storage swales. Exactly, absolutely. I think that's the permaculture principles are very applicable in many cases, and a lot of the sort of quote unquote farmers are not necessarily well versed with them. So I'd really like to advocate, integrating the insights of our different constituencies. The biodynamic community has a bunch of really insightful things to offer. The permaculture community has a lot to offer. The regenerative community. There's all kinds of different sort of wings of the broader soil food movement. And I think personally myself, growing up in the organic wing, I was relatively ignorant to the insights of permaculture for many years. Would have been very benefited by being exposed to that. So I certainly advocate people in this time of winter and study broadening their base of knowledge. So okay, we've talked about minerals, we've talked about water to some extent, we've talked about aeration, the microbes themselves. How do you get them back in to the soil? This is probably one of the least expensive, least effortful biggest bang for your buck, you know, suggestions that I'll make here today of all the things that I've been recommending. Re-inoculation is a very simple and very inexpensive and very beneficial thing to do. So I would say if you're going to take one thing home from today, or you're already at home probably, if you're going to act on one thing today, from today, if I could make a suggestion, it would be to inoculate your seed. There are numerous ways of procuring inoculants. You can buy them. There are some pretty good products out there that have nice broad spectrum inoculants that have dozens or more species and families of bacteria and fungi. You can go out and harvest your own from the local ecosystem. You can make your own teas and ferments. There's a number of ways of accessing that broader spectrum, but simply I like to suggest at least to expose your seeds to those microbes at germination or at planting. Simply what I do, I think I've got a jar right here of an inoculant. I'm not sure if people can see it, but it's a sort of a, oops, there it goes all over my computer. Oops, a daisy. That was a mistake. You basically, you know, this is an ounce of inoculant. It will be good for about 50 pounds of seed. You know, literally open up the seed packet, take a pinch of that, put it in the seed packet, close the seed packet, shake it up, and those spores are in contact with the seeds. Think of it as the colostrum. You know that a baby, when it's born, needs to get its colostrum from the mother's breast to establish gut flora before it can digest the milk, before it can digest food. When we're born, we don't have anybody in our alimentary canal. There are no microbes. We have no gut flora. That must be established at birth. And the colostrum, that's what colostrum is for. And our seeds, in many cases, if we're not saving them from healthy mother plants, if they're coming from, you know, some corporate production process, especially if we're not getting certified organic seed, but even if we are getting seed, organic seed, in many cases, the gut flora that should be coming on them is not on them. And so this is a really, really simple thing you can do, is get that inoculant in contact with the seed before planting. As the, you know, the moisture and the warmth causes the seed to germinate, it will also exactly at the same time cause the microbes to, the spores to germinate, and they'll set up that symbiotic relationship at that moment. And then when you transplant, et cetera, or if this is happening in the soil, you're planting those seeds right into the soil, that, you know, that will basically reestablish that community. It doesn't need to be done every year necessarily. If you're saving seed from healthy mother plants and you've got the soil well managed. If you're buying seed and you're planting it into potting soil, probably you do need to be inoculating your seed every year. But very inexpensive. This would maybe cost $5 or $10. Can pelleted seed be inoculated? You can put the inoculants onto that pelleted seed when the clay sort of swells up and the roots come out. You will get that effect. It may take a little bit longer because the microbes are not directly on the seed coat, but it's a hell of a lot better than not doing it. And if for your purposes you need to use pelletized seed for efficiency or whatever it is, it can be done. When you have seed that is coated with fungicides, so you know, people maybe have seen those blue seeds or red seeds that you can sometimes see in the farm supply store. Many farmers that are sort of growing corn and soy, you know, it's basically the only way you get that seed is coated with a fungicide. And so then putting the inoculant, the spores of a fungus onto fungicide, one could realize is fairly counterproductive. So you certainly do not want to be having those kinds of coats on your seed. In fact, it ensures that the plants don't have a good, well-established gut flora, and they need fertilizer to be able to grow. So one could argue it's beneficial for the fertilizer company for seeds to have those kinds of coats on them, but it certainly is not beneficial for the soil life. So inoculation, very, very simple. There are other techniques of harvesting and manufacturing your own inoculants. We probably don't have time for that today, but the point I want to make is about inoculation as a piece of this broader puzzle, and ensuring that you're establishing, reestablishing good gut flora for the plant at birth. It's a really foundational piece of the puzzle. So we've talked about air, we've talked about water, we've talked about minerals, we've talked about biology. Food probably is the last one, and I talked about it a little bit with the concept of the plants having green leaves and the mulch over the winter. Certainly, you know, in my farm, when I'm planting my kale seedlings out, I give my kale seedlings pretty good space. I give them about 3 feet on center, because a healthy kale plant, it wants some space to reach out, right? It wants to be able to have that sort of a wingspan. And you put that little seedling in the ground, it's not very tall, it's not very big, you got a lot of space. You don't want to leave that soil bare for, the number of weeks it'll take for that to cover. So I generally will mulch immediately after transplanting anything that's getting any kind of a space. So peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, summer squash, winter squash, anything that's gonna, you put in and give lots of space between them. In the spring, I like to cover that soil. It does an amazing job on keeping the weeds down. Nature does not like bare soil. Oftentimes you till it before you plant, and that, disturbs the soil structure, kills off the fungi, causes the bacteria to show up, which is the perfect environment for what we call weeds to grow. So if you minimize your disturbance and keep the soil covered, effectively you've got an environment where the weeds don't grow. And for anybody who's spent too much time weeding, I'm certainly one of those people, or many more hours than I would have chosen if I could choose in my childhood. Keeping the soil covered keeps the soil fed, keeps the soil moist, keeps the soil aerated, keeps the weeds down. So I generally will mulch as soon as possible after transplant, and then may need to re-up the mulch again in July if the soil life is a little bit too happy and is eating it all. People may have seen that. You put a good 3 or 4 inches of mulch down in April or May, and then a couple months later, most of it's gone because the soil life has eaten it up. That's a good sign that your soil life is so active. But then I like to oftentimes undersow with a cover crop sometime in that sort of August, September window. So as the mulch is being eaten up by the soil life and sort of getting less and less cover on the soil, I'll watch for a hurricane or tropical storm or a couple of thunderstorms to come through and broadcast a cover crop mix underneath the tomatoes, underneath the peppers, the eggplants, the kale, the collards, anything that's got any kind of a size to it. You can plant the cover crops in August or September while your crops are still growing. By the time the cover crops get big enough to start competing for sunlight with your crops, then your season for the crops is going to be over. So you don't need to wait until after after the frost kills the tomatoes to put the cover crops in. You can put them in earlier, let the frost kill the tomatoes, let the tomato bodies, sort of their stalks and everything else fall down, but you can pivot from lots of luscious crops growing to a well-established cover crop, ecosystem with no soil disturbance, by strategically, paying attention to timing and weather and things like that. So keeping the soil covered effectively keeps the soil fed. And I think, in my mind, as I said earlier, nature does not seem to prefer bare soil, at least when she's flourishing. And so everything we can do to maintain those understories and polycultures and at least soil cover through the entire growing season, I think is very wise. So, all right, I got a couple more questions here. Source of inoculant, I only see seed bean pea inoculant. Yes, okay, so historically, people have been aware of the bean and pea inoculant. We know that the legume family of plants have these nodules on their roots in which nitrogen fixing microbes live. People they know that vetch and clover and peas can functionally fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And this is something that we've understood for many decades now, that inside those nodules, the Azotobacter and Rhizobacter live, and they functionally pull nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and make it available for the plant. So people have added those inoculants to their beans and peas for a while now. Interestingly, minor point, in all bean and pea inoculant is an element called molybdenum. And you don't necessarily put it on the label, but it's in there because the microbes, the Azotobacter and the Rhizobacter, need to use an enzyme, a little tool, a 9/16 socket called the nitrogenase enzyme, to pull the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And in the same way I said before that B12 has cobalt at the center of it, and if you don't have cobalt in the environment, then anybody who needs B12 to live will be dead. If you want to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, you have to have the nitrogenase enzyme. And to have that enzyme, you must have molybdenum present. And so actually, minor point, but bean and pea inoculant has that added to it. So if you're familiar with that concept about adding microbes to certain plants' seeds when you plant them so certain things will happen, what you're looking for is a product which is not a bean and pea inoculant, but a much broader source spectrum inoculant. There are a few companies that I think I can safely recommend do a good job. There's Agridynamics in Pennsylvania. They've got some good inoculants. I think I saw Seven Springs Farm here pop up with a question. I bet they've got pretty good inoculants. I know Advancing Eco Ag, they've got good inoculants. There's a bunch of companies out there that are sourcing and doing a good job with this. Tanio out in the West Coast makes some pretty good materials. What you're looking for is a broad spectrum inoculant, and you'll find it at any agronomy consulting farm supply store organization company that's aligned with sort of biological principles. You're not going to necessarily find these things in your local agway or hardware store, garden supply store. You're probably going to find these at the companies or networks that are supporting more deeper biological principles. So hopefully that's a sufficient answer. Seeding living mulches like Dutch white clover, low growing nitrogen fixing competition between beds within the bed. Yeah. I love to put clover, white or red, in the pathways between beds at planting in the spring. Either mulch heavily or get clover in. Always a good idea. Certainly clover underneath things like broccoli and cauliflower is great. If you plant the clover at the same time that you transplant the broccoli, it's likely that you will have too much competition. That's likely that they'll establish too strongly depending on your seed density, and the broccoli won't grow fast. So you do usually want to give your annual crops a little bit of a heads up, a lead time before getting those understories planted, if you're doing it in the bed, which is why I'd like to do sort of the mulch at planting, and then as the mulch just dissipates, the plants are bigger, then I can put the broad spectrum understory in. But yeah. Okay. So we've used up about an hour, got about a half an hour left. I covered most of the basic points that I wanted to. I can go into various points in greater or less detail, depending on what people are looking for. I do see the one question about the spectrometer, which I'm happy to answer. But if there's other agronomy questions, happy to answer those first. No? All right, well, I guess we can keep going back and forth. So where is my spectrometer? Here it is. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that our organization has been working for the past 4 years on this project called the Real Food Campaign. And the Real Food Campaign is a collaboration of a number of different organizations, nonprofits, farmers, consumers, chefs, companies, researchers, foundations, different constituencies. And we have a sort of a three-legged stool of a priority, three things we're trying to accomplish. One is to build a meter that can be used to test nutrient levels in crops non-invasively at point of purchase. So basically what we're talking about is being able to go up to the grocery store or at the farmer's market, flash a light at the carrot, and get a reading back that says this is junk, or this is decent, or this is good. And so the sort of the premise behind all this is that depending on how crops are grown, the nutrient levels in them vary very significantly. So people may have had the experience of eating a carrot fresh out of the garden in the summertime and experiencing that really sort of rich, aromatic, crisp, flavorful, experience of a carrot. And they may also have had the experience in the wintertime of buying a bag from Cal Organic that when you bite into it, causes you to feel a little bit repulsed. There may be a flavor experience, it's bitter, or it's just not particularly compelling, right? Maybe you've had the experience with a tomato from the garden versus a tomato from the grocery store, or maybe a peach. You've eaten a peach ripe off of a tree and you've bought a peach at a grocery store. As animals, we are wired with very sophisticated nutrient monitoring devices called noses and tongues, which can tell us what's good for us and what's not. And when we, I would say, eat that Cal Organic carrot that tells us that it's not very tasty, it's also telling us it's not very good for us. It may not be toxic because it doesn't have, synthetic chemicals applied to its production, but from a nutritional standpoint, it doesn't have in it what our bodies are telling us we need. And so the basic point that we're focusing on here at the BFA is that we think nutrition should be the objective, not the label, not the organic label, not the biodynamic label, not the regenerative label, not the non-GMO label. What we think the objective should be is the nutritional value, which we think correlates with flavor and aroma and health-giving attribute. And we think plant health, et cetera, like I said at the beginning of the presentation. So the question then becomes, if we're not trying to have a certification process to label things, but we're trying to actually test and see what they are so we can make decisions in real time, anybody, not just the consumer, but the buyer, the wholesaler, the retailer, the packer, the processor, can we give people the ability to make decisions about what they are working with based on nutritional metrics? And so our thought is, to do that, we need to be able to assess things in real time. And the way you would do that is through what's called a spectrometer. Spectroscopy is a pretty well-established scientific field. I use the example of astronomers who speak with confidence about what stars are made up of. Alpha Centauri is 51% hydrogen, 48% helium, et cetera, et cetera. Alpha Centauri's 4 light years away. How the hell do they know what Alpha Centauri is made up of? Because we've only gotten something barely out of our solar system, which is 12 light hours away. Right? We've never gotten to 4 light years away. How do the astronomers know what Alpha Centauri is made up of? They know because every element in chemistry is a vibration in physics. Copper vibrates at a certain frequency. It makes a certain light. Zinc vibrates at a certain frequency. It makes a certain light. And so when we take a picture of the light that's coming off of Alpha Centauri, we can see, oh, actually, this is what it's made up of. And so our thought is, if we can see what something 4 light years away is made up of, then we can see what something a millimeter away is made up of, right? We should be able to use that same principle. And so the first thing we've done is, with the Real Food Campaign, is we built a little handheld spectrometer. It's rudimentary, but it's functional. It's open source. And so the question was about what does this measure? But I'll get to that in a second. I just want to just a couple other points about the Real Food Campaign and what we've been doing. So I said there's a three-legged stool of priorities or objectives. One is to build a tool that could be used to measure nutrient levels in real time with a flash of light, non-invasively, and we've done that. The second thing is to define nutrient density. People may have heard the term nutrient density and sort of vaguely understand that it refers to things being more nutritious than other things. And that's our hypothesis, but there is no actual database which says this is the maximum potential of what could be in a carrot, and this is the minimum potential of what could be in a carrot. Because until we have the high and the low, we can't say this is in the 80th percentile or this is in the 20th percentile. We can flash a light at a carrot and get a reading back of different nutrient levels, but we can't say where it sits in the continuum. So step one is to build the meter. Step two is to figure out what quality is. And step three is to figure out what causes it. Ideally, we want to be able to correlate different management practices, different fertility programs, different biomes with nutrient density, with soil health, so that we can support growers in changing their practices to increase that overall system function. So we have established a couple of labs now. We've got one in Michigan, one in California, one in France. We've been sending in thousands of samples of crops and the soil they grew in. This is a part of the project that VABF was part of this year. With, I'm not sure how many grower partner farms. I think it was at least a few. And so we have the farmers, write down what they did. We've got a sort of a series of questions. When did you till? If so, how deeply? When did you use cover crops? What was your fertilizer? When did you plant? What was the variety? Did you irrigate with what? How? Did you do any side dressing? And then we also ask them to, when the crop is harvested, to take a sample of the soil that crop grew in and send the crop and the soil into the lab. So we have the environmental conditions and management data and the soil metrics and the crop nutrients and the crop data. So yeah, that's moving along quite nicely. And what we've been doing in the lab is when that soil comes in, we flash a light at it with a meter and get a reading. And when the crop comes in, we flash a light at it with the meter and get a reading. And then we put that soil and that crop through a series of other sort of benchtop lab techniques, and we test the copper and the zinc and the antioxidants and the polyphenols. And so what we've been able to do so far, to finally get to the point of answering your question here, where we're at right now is we have enough metadata from sending thousands of samples of crops into the lab to correlate the graph that spits out of this thing with high levels of antioxidants or low levels of antioxidants, so, or polyphenols, etc. So we're not actually testing nutrients with this meter. We're taking a picture of the light that bounces back, and we're saying that looks like the picture that we know means high levels of antioxidants and polyphenols. And so we can say what we're going to be having coming out in June will be the updated version, which gives you a red, yellow, green reading. So this is in the top 25%. This is in the bottom 25%. This is the middle 50%. So this version of the meter right now does not actually test nutrients specifically. It uses metadata to build correlation matrices, which say the predictive likelihood that this is of high quality is, 80%, or of medium quality is 80%. We are beginning now to work on, we've actually got a pretty significant donation just in the past week. And we're now starting to engineer the next generation meter, which will be able to test nutrients directly. So we will be able to say exactly 2 parts per million copper, 18 parts per million zinc, et cetera. So it will be a real scientific instrument, but we're not there yet. Anyway, that's a long answer to a good question, whoever Rise Up Rooted is. All right. Looking for some more interaction to guide my my next comments. Who wants to jump in? I can't see who else is here. Aaron or Lindsay, do you have any questions or comments or thoughts? You're both muted, it looks like. Perhaps neither of you want to say anything. I'm not sure. We pay $4 a bale for weed-free straw, which can get expensive. Any suggestion from Carrie? Mulche is what I use, which is far from weed-free. Usually you can get it for $1 a bale, a square bale. Sometimes you can get round bales for $10 or $15. My thought is that I'm not afraid of weeds per se. That any field that I'm growing in probably was a hay field at some point, and those hay seeds fell in the numbers of millions and millions and millions. And so, you know, the act of getting to a weed seed bank that's totally empty, I think will require a lot of stale seed bedding, a lot of destruction of soil structure. So my suggestion is that keeping the soil well covered. In my experience, basically when the sunlight can't hit the soil, then weed seeds don't germinate. So that's generally my model. You know, I don't see bare soil and pretty lines of plants in nature. So I don't think that's an objective that we should be aiming towards, although I know some people do have that sort of as their aesthetic. If I've got a big curly dock or a nettle or a red clover or a dandelion that's showing up in the field, I would just think of that as nature's cover crop. That nature, grows these plants for a reason. And so if it's not directly competing immediately with a crop plant, or even if it is, if it looks like it wants to be there, I let them be. So I guess there is a bit of a sort of a philosophical framework about what are we trying to accomplish? What does success look like? In my mind, success does not look like, a monoculture of carrots or cucumbers or tomatoes. It looks like a polyculture as much as possible. But in general, mulch is my suggestion. It's much less expensive, and to the point about weed seeds, I'm not concerned. I would say one other thing to say is that when you disturb the soil, the more you disturb the soil, it seems like the faster the weeds germinate, call them what they will. And so the less you disturb the soil, if you're just making a row to plant your carrots and everything else is left as it was, my experience is that the weeds that come in to overgrow the carrots don't show up. It's when you till the bed first and then plant your carrots that all the weeds show up. And so there's a real interesting point there about a light touch and a gentle touch actually helping to prevent some of these foundational problems from occurring in the first place. Thoughts on mixed cover crops from Roger. Why should I do that? I'd like to ask the question, where in nature do you see a monoculture? You don't usually see monocultures in nature. You see polycultures in nature. My understanding is that in the same way that a cow has a different gut flora from a pig, and a pig has a different gut flora from a chicken, that the clover has a different gut flora from oat, has a different gut flora from a daikon. And so if the success and flourishing of the microbes is at the foundation of our objective, then the more species of plants we have present, the more diversity of gut flora, the broader the diversity of the microbes in the environment. And so in many cases, as farmers, we are actually engaging in mini monocultures I'm going to have my tomatoes over here, or my potatoes over there, or my cucumbers over there. At least during the cover crop section of the year, we can have a polyculture, and we can have that much greater diversity of microbial species present. And so that's my biggest answer to the question why you should do mixed cover crops. It really does foundationally establish that broad base of microbial communities that we're looking for. Certainly different plants have synergies, and they seem to do better together than apart. You get more done with the same amount of space with a nice mix of plants. But again, what is the mix? When do you plant it? There's all kinds of nuances, which I'm not covering here sufficiently, but that's the basic point, I think. Permies recommend polycultures and guilds. Yes, exactly. So I think that's a lot to the point I was just making. Which crops are the deep-rooted cover crops? Do you have favorite combinations? I'm not sure if I could say I got a favorite combination. So yeah, anybody that's got the root that looks like a dandelion would be the first one I would think of as a deep-rooted cover crop. That sort of structure of a deep, strong taproot. People talk about oats and rye actually having a good root system. I think I read somewhere that one rye plant can have a 16-mile root system when you add up all of the root hairs and everything else. They can go down quite far. Some people talk about daikons and the those sort of brassica family plants. In my experience, if you have a subsoil compaction, the daikon just goes up out of the ground. It doesn't actually go down into the ground. So anybody that's got that sort of that taproot structure. So look through your cover crop sources. Generally, it's a mix you're looking for, and I don't think I've got a good answer. And then there's people out there that know more than I do about those kinds of mixes. Generally, I try to say at least 3 different families of plants if you can. So in this case, a daikon would be from the brassica family. A clover or a vetch would be from the what are they called? Legume family. An oat or a rye would be from the grass family. So at least 3 different families of plants if you can. Some cover crops are winter killer cover crops. That means they'll die when the temperature gets down below 10. And then you've got that, you don't have to worry about any soil prep or killing of the cover crops in the spring when you're planting. Other cover crops will keep growing all winter long, like rye and vetch, clover. So if you're going to be planting those, you're going to need to have a strategy for killing them in the springtime. So thoughts on biochar? What does it do? How does it work? Is it worth it? Excuse me, I'm talking a lot. Thoughts on biochar? I think biochar became famous about 10 years ago or so now with the work. It came out of Brazil. It was called Terra Preta from the Amazon. What they found were that actually, who knew, there were tens of millions of people living in really almost Edenic, civilizations when Pizarro came through in the, I guess it was early 1500s. And they were actively engaging in, what we would call, permaculture now in the Amazon. It was not all, 80 and 200 foot tall trees. It was actually bananas and all kinds of other stuff managed well, coppiced. And in the areas where these communities were, these cities, the soil was rich and dark color. And the rest of the Amazon soil is a very red, weathered laterite soil. It's a weak soil. But they had figured out some way to keep it so that 500 years later, the soil was rich and dark. And what it was this terra preta, they call it terra preta, with dark earth, was a basically charcoal. And instead of doing slash and burn, they would do slash and char, and they would create charcoal, which has a amazingly large exchange capacity. It has the ability to hold anions and cations. So the weakness of the soil, the things leaching out, is exactly what biochar, balances out. People may be familiar with humates, which is a mined material, which has similar capacity. So I would say the biochar does fit an ecological niche. It does provide a lot of value. It is a categorically stable soil carbon sink. It's a home for microbes. Think of it as like a, you've got the reef in the ocean where all the life is living in and operating from around. Biochar functions like a microbial reef in the soil. It really does some wonderful things to support overall function. Biochar as a product that is marketed and sold is oftentimes more expensive than is a reasonable investment for a farmer. Again, if you're a gardener, I think it's something that you can explore and experiment with and play around with. If you aren't thinking about dollars per acre on your 200 square foot garden, then you don't mind $20 for biochar or $50 for biochar. But if you were to amortize that out over an acre, from a farmer's perspective, they would never be able to justify the cost. So I think it is a valuable amendment. In general, it's a great thing to be putting into your compost pile when you build a compost pile. By itself, it's actually like an empty tank and will pull things from around it. But if you put it into a compost pile when it's being built, then when it enters the soil, it'll be a full tank and it'll be in a much better shape. I think biochar is best utilized as part of a whole system solution. So if you're burning wood to heat your home or to heat a hoop house, you can have a biochar burner instead of a regular wood stove, where you can get the heat and you can have biochar as a byproduct. There's also some interesting stuff being done with biochar to be able to, in the process of making the biochar, harvest off of it what would be able to go into a gas tank of a car and drive, or the gas tank of a tractor, the diesel tank of a tractor and drive, or the propane tank of a stove and cook. So there are some really interesting ways to use wood to fuel our hydrocarbon systems and have a byproduct, which is biochar. So in that kind of a model, I think it's a really, really exciting piece of the puzzle. But if it's just a straight up purchased product, it's difficult to have it be not more expensive than would make it viable for a farm scale operation. So that's my thoughts on biochar. And it looks like we're almost at the end of our hour and a half. Any other questions? Nope. You want to say any closing words, Lindsay?
Hey, thank you guys for coming. Does anyone have any more questions? We can raise hands as well and allow you to talk directly. Dan, do you want to tell everyone about your conference coming up?
Sure. Yeah. Starts on Thursday, goes for 8 months. We have historically had a 2-day sort of everybody gets together kind of event, and we are not wanting to do the 2 days on Zoom model, and so we had a bunch of speakers lined up, and we're now going to be doing them every Thursday at 3 Eastern, starting this Thursday, going through September. And it's soilandnutrition.org. I would say we've got some brilliant speakers, and we've got scholarships available, and yeah, price should not be an issue. Um, yeah, I think we just counted it yesterday, people from 25 countries, 6 continents, and 40 states. It's like, I don't know, I'm totally excited. Great global community, and yeah, great topics. So soil and nutrition.org if people want to check it out. Yeah. And put my email on there, Lindsay. Dan at bionutrient.org to the question about my contact info. There you go. Beautiful.
Thank you. I also wanted to say, if you use the code VABF when you sign up for the Soil Nutrition Conference, VABF gets $25 every time that code is used. So please use it.
Try to share the wealth.
Yes, appreciate that.
Yeah. So cool. And if you missed the first one, we have 31 more. So you don't have to register by Thursday, but all the recordings will be available for people within 24 hours or 48 hours who are registered but didn't make the event. And then we will, as we always have done, make those available freely on our YouTube channel, probably a month or 6 weeks after the event. So we do have the last 9 years of our conference recordings on our YouTube page. Every presenter we've had so far recorded. So for those who have not enough podcasts or things to listen to, there's some pretty good stuff in the archives. Thank you for that.